Welcome to the Hunting Beast Report, a live video podcast with Dan Infalt and host Jeremy Gillespie.
All right, Dan, we're live. How you doing tonight?
Good. How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing good. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year.
Are you a resolution type of guy or no?
No. I was in bed by about like 8 o'clock. And then on New Year's Day, I was up at like 3 in the morning and did some computer work, some editing, and then I hit the woods.
Yeah, it's that time of year. And speaking of hitting the woods, it's a great time of year to kick off, especially across a lot of the Midwest. Been a pretty warm start to the year. So a lot of places that would normally have snow don't. So a good time to get out and see some of that post-rut sign. So today, in that spirit, we're going to talk about buck bedding, which is something that you're known for. That's your bread and butter for sure. So a whole bunch of topics to kick off. And before we get started, we're going to talk about types of beds, how to be a detective, how close to get to beds, young buck versus old buck bedding. So we got a whole list of topics here. And if we don't get through them all, we talked about this, we might make it a two-part one. But on that note, Dan, let's start off with the types of beds. And you've often talked about like primary bedding, wind-based bedding, some of those other variables. So why don't you kick it off there? And when you go out into the woods, how do you identify these beds? What clues kind of indicate to you that it's a certain type of bedding or another?
Well, primary bedding is what I consider bedding that's like year-round or close to year-round. You're bedding there all the time. What I am learning through cameras and through observations and stuff, even those types of areas have peak periods of time that they bed there the most. But just thinking back to some of the primary bedding areas I've found, like where I shot the Rome Legend, that was a primary bedding area. I've probably shot, I don't know, 7, 8 deer bucks out of that bedding area. The exact beds he came out of. And when there's ever a good buck in that area, that'd be the first place I'd expect them to be. If they're in that general area. Now, if they move off for food or something, they might not be there. But what that looks like, a primary bedding area is usually a place that for some reason people just don't go into it. One reason or another, they don't go into that little section. And a primary bedding area is usually, I want to say, maybe from a quarter acre to an acre in size. Maybe an eighth of an acre to a quarter acre in size. But you might have like a quarter acre area that has 100 different beds in it. And maybe there's 30 of them in there that are real worn out. And some people mistake that for doe bedding because of the number of beds, but it's just that bucks are using it so often. And what they'll do is they'll shift around. So it might only be one buck in there at a time. Maybe two if it's big enough. They'll get on either end and kind of use it like two bedding areas. But they'll actually get up, they'll shift from bed to bed based on the wind and stuff. Or they'll get up and feed a little bit and move to another one. And I noticed that when I've observed deer for a couple of days in a row, it seems like the same timing. Like they go to one bed first, they move to another one at a certain time. It seems to have to do with probably air current shifts or the sun. I know they don't like the bedding in direct sun. So if you see a bush blocking it and there's a time period when the sun's hitting that bed, he's moving from that bed. And they do not like sitting in the blazing sun unless they have to. I've seen them bed in the sun, like in grass and stuff, but usually it's under pressure, like hunting pressure or something. But you know, those bedding areas aren't as easy to find as what you'd think. We find a few, but when you find one, as long as it's not being abused by somebody else, and you hunt it right, you can kill a good buck out of there every year. You can go back, every single year in the same time frame and shoot a buck off of that area. The reason people don't do that is because they get greedy. They go in there like 6 or 7 times in a year, and think they can get away with like If you went in there, I'll wait a week or two. Maybe if I wait 2 weeks, 2 weeks, your scent's still there from 2 weeks ago. So does deer know you were there. So that's primary bedding. I've killed quite a few deer on primary bedding. There's a spot where we do our drives in the cattails, where there's a unique bedding area that's in cattails, but dry cattails. And there's probably, if you walk through there, we're probably going to do our workshops in that section this year. I want to change it up because we got a lot of guys coming back that came years ago, and I want to move to a new section so that they're not seeing the same stuff over and over again. But this one bedding area there probably has 30, 40 beds in an acre size, maybe not quite an acre, 3/4 of an acre size area. There's probably 30, 40 beds, maybe more. Probably is more than 30 or 40. Beds are just worn in, but they're in the cattails, no bushes out there or nothing. And that area has a peak period of like right in mid to late November, which makes it great for gun hunting, for us. But there's deer that bed there all year. But that particular spot in gun season, there was one time frame where 8 years in a row from the same tree, the same day, opening day, I killed 8 good bucks in 8 years in the same spot, coming out of the same bed.
Hard to argue with that.
Yeah. That's a great thing to find, but you can't abuse it. You know what I mean? If we went in there and just pounded it all the time, it wouldn't be like that. So you got to find lots of options. When you get into like wind-based bedding now, that's a little different. I mean, that's where you get your leeward hills and the hill country. That's where you get farm bedding, where it's on the edge of a woods, or maybe it's in an open area where they're watching. Anytime they're observing you, like they're watching where you come from and stuff, that's usually wind-based, and they're usually not smelling you. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they'll get through thick cover and smell the entrance to a public property or something. But a lot of times they'll sit in a position where they can watch you and have the wind to their back. And you can always tell which way they're bedding in wind-based bedding, because the bed will be shaped like a bean, and the back of the bean is the back of the deer. The butt and the head kind of go forward, and the back circles around like a semicircle. It's like shaped like a bean. And then they're looking the other way of the bean. And they'll have the wind to their back, and they'll have an obstacle to their back. Mature bucks will almost always put something to their back where they're smelling through an obstacle, so you can't see them if you're coming in on a crosswind or something. They'll nestle up against that cover, and they'll have it open in front of them where they can see in front of them, smell behind them, but behind them they got a wall of something. They'll bed up against a rock, up against a tree, up against a wall of bushes, up against a patch of high grass, but they'll have something to their back on wind-based bedding. And the other main type of bedding is probably sound-based, where the wind-based is usually wind where they're smelling and they got sight. They have 2 factors there. Where sound-based, they only have to have one. And sound-based, they'll get like into thick cover a little bit, or surrounded by water up on a little island or something, where you can't get to them without making noise. And then their bed will just be in like a hole, like under a tree, in a cattail patch or something. And you can't get near them, because as soon as you start walking in there, you're going to make noise. If you're going to make sloshing, or you're going to have to break brush or something, and they'll get into those type of places. Those are kind of like your basics for bedding. I guess there's also some people call it pressure bedding, where deer go when pressure starts getting heavy. And what I find is there isn't really pressure bedding. What there is there's bedding that's picks up when pressure comes on, like more deer go in there. It seems like mature bucks pressure bed all the time. I mean, their spots are set up really good, but those really good setups that generally, have mature deer and maybe a couple smaller ones, Well, when there's pressure on, like gun season comes and stuff, all of a sudden there's, 10 times more small ones, and still the same big one that was always there or whatever, if he's still there. Is there any more? Yeah, rut bedding. We found that there's bedding where these bucks will bed downwind of doe bedding areas, and watch the entrance, smell the exit or whatever, and they'll monitor the does. And those beds are usually pretty flashy. You can hardly see the bed in the leaves because they're only bedding there for a very short time. It's like a week span, week and a half, 2 weeks, when there's rutting going on, and they're not there every day. And they rub the hell out of it because they're all aggressive for those does. So those beds are usually rubbed like crazy, but there's hardly a bed there. And that's usually and it's right up, like you get in the bed and you can see the exit for the doe bedding area. It gets a little, for me, it can be kind of obvious of what it is, but you do have a hard time making out the bed.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point you brought up, Dan, for people that are maybe having a problem distinguishing between what's a rut period bedding versus what's a buck bed, because both of them will have buck rubs, right? Like you said, but the bed in a buck bedding area, typically, especially in like the marsh, are a lot more defined than those rut beds would be. So if you're finding a heavily rubbed area and you're newer and you're having a hard time discerning which one it is, maybe look at how well used the bed is and the proximity to doe bedding a lot of times.
Yeah. And also too, I mean, start talking about rubs and beds. When you look at buck bedding areas, and you're trying to decipher whether it's a buck bedding area or a doe bedding area, or if there's big bucks bedding there, you got to look at where the rubs are located. The rubs on a buck bed will actually be right in the bed. There'll be some on the trails going in and out of there, don't get me wrong, but they will actually mark their beds. They're competing against other bucks for that bedding area, right? They'll mark the actual bed that they bed in. And when it's doe bedding, or there's does bedding there that they're looking to get, they'll be rubbing the downwind side or the trails going in and out. It might be upwind or downwind, but it'll be on the trails and never on the beds, because the bed rubs are actually a buck rubbing it while they're at the bed, either right after they get up or right before they lay down. And that's a good indicator. A lot of people don't get that them buck beds, when I'm saying they're rubbed, I mean right in the bed. The tree will be right at the bed, will be rubbed.
Dan, one of the other things that I know this comes up, or it used to come up on the forum all the time, and you call it playing detective. So when you're out scouting, for people that are still picking up these methods, or even people that are experienced, you're really good at deciphering what time of a year that bed's going to be used based on the sign around it. And I sent you the thumbnail. It's got the buck that you shot a couple of years ago, and you had a real good hunch that was early season bedding. So maybe talk us through that one specifically, how you determined that was early season bedding. And then when you're looking at some of these other beds, what are some of the little tips and clues you've picked up over the years to help you decipher what time of year that bed's being used?
Yeah, I was just looking at beds 2 days ago, whenever it was, maybe it was yesterday. Yeah, yesterday morning. And I went all the way across this swamp to get to the other side, where it went up against the private. And I kind of figured the swamp was too thick for bucks. I mean, you couldn't get a rack through there. I couldn't even get my body through there, and everything was underwater. And I kind of lost sign once I got into this swamp, but I wanted to see what was on the other side, because I knew nobody else was doing this. Because you had to go through, first you had to walk a long ways, and then you had to drop into this tag swamp that's so thick you got to fight through it for a half mile to get to this back border of this property. And the back border of the property looked a little open. I thought maybe there'd be a couple trees I could hunt. I would still have to figure out how to get back there. But I came through and I found those beds. And, first thing I noticed was the beds had rubs in them. So they were buck beds. But a lot of the rubs were on like those tags that got the orange bark. And when they rub those, it's bright orange and it's sappy for about 2-3 weeks. And I noticed that where they were rubbed, it was from this year, but they were white and dry as a bone, and the tree was dead. And you could see there's no leaves on it, not even dead leaves from it dying. So you could tell that was done well before November. So you could say that was done early season. And it was a repetitive thing. I found like one bed that had a fresher rub in it. And, started looking around and you look at the beds, and the beds would have like leaves and stuff on it that were like curled, and some grasses sticking up a little bit, and some sticks that had fallen in there, and like twig sticks, and they're not flattened. They're not kicked out of the way. They're not scratched out. You could tell nothing's laid there in a while. And then you start to put together that they're there in September. And then you look up and, like, why are they here in September? You look up and in the distance, you can see all the trails go to a little point on this private land. And the only thing around, there's no crops, no nothing, is this little oak island. It's the only place there's acorns out there. And there was an acorn year this year. So I bet you next year, if there's no acorns on that island, those beds probably don't even get used. But now on a separate section of the same swamp, I found rubs that were fresh recently. I mean, I found shavings on top of the snow. I found tracks going into the beds where I didn't see where deer bedded, but I did kick a deer out of a bed in there. I didn't figure out where it bedded, a young buck. But then I found one bed in there that looked really good, that had fresh tracks going up into it. And the buck walked into each bed and checked it out like he was going to lay down and smelled the wind and then moved on, which is common. When you track them in the snow, you see that a lot. Like when they're going to bed up, they'll go into a bedding area and check a bunch of beds and then move to another bedding area and check a bunch of beds and then finally lay down. It's like they got to have the wind currents right or something. The buck you were talking about, that buck, I hunted that thing for years. And it lived in a wide open cattail marsh. It was just hard to hunt. No, it's just pulling my hair out, trying to find some way to get that buck. And what I eventually did is just wandering around in the winter, trying to find something. I found this little high spot in the cattails that you couldn't really see on an aerial. You couldn't really see from a distance because it had willow brush, but the willow brush was the same height as the cattails. So you really couldn't see anything over them. And in summer, they're green just like the cattails. But when I got in there, all that willow brush was rubbed, and I could see it was old rubs, just like I did this weekend. And you could tell it was September, that was done. You could see that the leaves off the willow brush fall down in early October. So I'm not thinking any deer are bedding in there after mid-October or in rut. But it was tore up to the point where I know that when they're bedding there, there's got to be a good buck there all the time. And it's right in the core area where I knew that buck lived. That one, and actually there's another real big buck that lived in that area too. So I wasn't positive which one it was, but I was kind of leaning on that one. And I could see that there was a heavy trail coming out of there. I mean, just beat coming out of there, going straight into a point. And there was a tree 75 yards from those beds. Now the tree that I had to get in, was this big around. It could only get like 8 feet off the ground, but that's the kind of crap you get. But it was a unique situation where I could do a setup. And the biggest thing that killed that deer, bigger than me finding that setup, bigger than me figuring out when he was going to be bedding there, was the fact that he, excuse me, I kind of lost my place there. I started thinking ahead of myself.
Yeah. So you're talking about finding that setup in the tags there and the dry cattails, and then bigger than killing that deer, bigger than the setup was, and then that's where we lost you.
I know. I lost myself. I'm getting old, I guess. But,
yeah, it happens.
What I was going to say is the thing that was bigger than that setup was the fact that I was patient, that I waited for exactly the right wind, exactly the right day. And when I failed the first time, I didn't go back. I didn't push that deer once he was on to me to the point where he abandoned that spot or abandoned that point, or knew that that was a dangerous spot. It had never been dangerous to him ever till that first day I sat it. And then he still didn't know I was there. He knew some doe was going crazy by me blowing, and he just turned around and left. So when so then I abandoned the area. I knew he was going to smell me in there when he did come through. And I didn't have him come in and circle around downwind, and then he catches me, and then he's blowing and all that crap because he's onto that spot. I just let him have it. I waited a year. I did actually give it one more hunt, honestly, but even that was pushing it. But then the third hunt, when I went in there the next year, I ended up killing him on the first hunt. But most guys, once they knew that buck was bedding there, they would have hunted the piss out of it. And that would have destroyed their chances of killing that deer. These deer aren't stupid. They don't get to be 5 or 6 years old in these pressured areas by making mistakes.
Yeah, and you talk about it all the time, and it's worth repeating because I don't think it sinks in. A lot of times it's, like you said, if every 5-year-old buck walked past every big rub in daylight, it would never make it because that's what everybody's looking for. That's the setups, the big rub in the hardwoods is what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So you gotta search out those unique places and those places where you might catch them moving in daylight.
Yeah, a lot of times you just kind of got to take a property and you got to divide it up into pieces. And you got to say, okay, where could a big buck live? Well, this is where everybody wants to hunt, and if you're going out there and looking like everybody else, you're going to get the results of everybody else. You're going to find a few rubs. You're going to get teased. You're going to get a camera pick at night. You're going to, the same crap everybody else is getting. So you kind of got to look and say, okay, where is everybody going? What do I got to cross off here? And where is nobody going? And then my concentration is on where I think nobody is going. And I still run into people. And you still run into people that have figured out these side spots. But by looking in those areas, you're going to get onto these bucks faster. You're going to get onto those spots where nobody's looking faster. And that's the big unique thing. I mean, I've killed decent bucks, like good bucks, like big 2-year-olds, and 3-year-olds in pretty average spots, in spots where everybody hunts. And I think everybody occasionally gets deer like that. And some people get really good at killing 2-year-old and 3-year-old deer, and they put that 120-inch buck on the wall every year. And they never move on from that because that's what they're hunting. They're hunting 2- and 3-year-old bucks. In order to kill mature bucks, you got to hunt mature bucks, and mature bucks, by the time they're 4, 5, or 6 years old, they've figured those spots out. Either that or they're 5 or 6 years old because they figured that out young. But either way, you find them in spots where just people rarely go. And the biggest one I'm finding now, like my most recent successes, have been surrounded around areas that have dense cover up high and are kind of open below, like cedar swamps, like buckthorn swamps. Buckthorns are kind of new because it's an invasive species that just started popping up in the last 10 years like crazy. And buckthorn is pretty prevalent in a lot of places now. And around me, it's prevalent, and it gets up to about where your head's hitting the brush. And it's pretty thick up at head level. But if you bend down, you can see for a mile, and you really can't sit on the ground because there's no place to sit. But if you get just a little bit elevated, those deer walk through there like it's free, and they bed on the fringes of that. And nobody hunts it because there's no trees and there's no place to put a ground blind. And if somebody is hunting it, you see a ground blind from 600 miles away.
Yeah.
And so here, so those spots that people aren't getting into usually are the kind of spots where you find these big bucks, is spots where there just ain't a tree to hunt out of. They're in a ground blind situation to hunt out of. It's a very hard situation to hunt. And that's why I'm killing deer. And I have to have equipment and a system that I can utilize to get into those types of trees, which is where the beast gear comes in, and me, working until I had exactly what I needed to get into these trees and to get into these positions, to be small enough. And I don't like ground level. I mean, you almost always get busted in that open stuff. I mean, 1 out of 4 isn't good. I'd rather have 3 out of 4, you know, and you get just a little bit elevated. You just get into that brush and you got it so much better. I don't have to have much. I can be in a tree this big around. The biggest problem is not having the tree shake when you're drawing or something, because those small trees move around a lot. But I typically kill my deer in those spots where nobody else will or can set up. And a lot of it has to do with not the equipment I use actually, but the system. And it's not that my system is the best, it's that I know my system. You got to come up with your own system. So I have my system for how my sticks go on the stand. I have my system for where every piece of my equipment goes in my pockets and stuff. There's very little movement. I know where everything is. I don't forget nothing. You know, I got a clippers for those little dry dead branches, because if you saw them, they make noise. You know, I got a little saw for those green ones that, you know, like on buckthorn, you can saw that because it's invasive, you know. But you don't want to cut dead branches because they make a lot of noise, you know. And in Wisconsin, you can saw limbs on trees up against them, but you have to have the right saw that's got, you know, that doesn't make noise. They all make noise, but some of them are sharper and cut very much easier, and you can kind of, you know what I mean? But clippers are the best because clippers will, you can do it real quietly and make your way around a branch and not make noise. And, you know, I have a spot where my bow rope goes and everything. I go into a spot and I want to get in swampy terrain. I want to get within 75 yards of that bed if I can. Sometimes in hill country or open woods or something, or farmland, sometimes I got to be further away than that, but 100 or 150, sometimes even 200 yards back. But the further back you are, the less your odds are. Trails start to spider. You know, you get deer only move so far. Like when you look at the Rome legend buck, I watched that deer get out of his bed. The sun was still up. You know, it was on the horizon, but it was still up. By the time I shot that deer 75 yards from where he got up, it was closing time. If I was 200 yards back, I wouldn't even have seen it. You know, so you got to be within that range. So when I go in there, getting within that range is not an easy task. If you just go in there like a lot of people do and just walk to the trees, set up your stand, even if you're quiet, it's too much noise. You have to sneak. You have to be quiet. You have to slither in there. You have to think about things about like where your wind is going to go while you're walking in there, how your thermals are going to flow while you're walking there, how your thermals are going to flow after you're in there when the sun starts to go down. And then when you go in there, what I like to do is I like to come in there and come up to that tree and go on the back side of the tree if I'm going to get any elevation. So say I'm going to get, if it's a tree where I can get up, you know, 12 to 18 feet high, then I want to go up the back side of that tree and kind of look around that tree as I'm climbing. Keep backside so only on the very edges of the outside of the tree can something in front of me see me. So I'm going up that back side and I'm peeking around the tree. That way I'm looking in the direction of the deer. Because those deer don't always bed in the exact same spots, too. They move around a little bit. You know what I mean? They have beds around the bedding area. And sometimes you don't see them all because they don't bed there all the time. They'll shift around in the wind. You know what I mean? So you go up that tree and you're kind of watching to see if there's any kind of movement, any kind of deer or whatever. And you go up slow, stick at a time. First stick I set at the ground. And my system is the bottom step of my bottom stick is at my knee. That's my stride length. That's how high I can step. So I set that one up. And then I know that my sticks, when I set the next stick on top of the first stick, where the top of that stick is where the bottom of the next stick goes. So I can set the next stick up from ground level and still have my maximum stride. And then from there, I could just have to slip up one step. And I can do that on the third stick. And a lot of times that's a little higher I'm hunting is 3 sticks. Sometimes I get 4 or 5, depending on the spot. And then I got to climb up and down, but it's just the last stick, you know. And then when I put the stand on, I'm looking around that tree. I just slide that stand around the tree and I hook it on. And then I roll around that tree and get into it. And I pull up my bow with the rope that I've already hooked on. You know, I take my stand up with my last stick too. So it's just one trip. So that system's pretty important for hunting beds. It doesn't mean that you need to do it exactly like I do. I'm just saying you have to have a system so all your stuff is ready and you're not fumbling around. You're not half prepared. You're not forgetting stuff. I have a pocket for everything that I have so that I never forget something.
Yeah, that first year when I first started running Lone Wolf, when I got on the Beast, probably back actually, I think I started running the Lone Wolf like a year before the Beast, 2012, 2013. I think I made every mistake possible where I would like put my strap around and I'd have it around one of the wires that runs from the seat post tube to the stand. And then I'd try to fold the stand down. I couldn't fold it down. And like you said, all that stuff, one, I was learning, but two, if you have a system and you get consistent with the way that you're doing that every time, then you're getting quieter, you're getting more efficient. And it's just, it takes practice though. I mean, there's a learning curve there for sure.
Even the way I wrap my strap around and I take it off, even the way the strap wraps around and hooks back up on the stand so that it's nice and tight and in the right position. A clanking buckle can just cost you that buck.
Yeah, and that's it's just like shooting your bow, right? Reps. The more reps you get, the more consistent you get with your bow. The more reps you get with your setup, the more efficient you get, and the better you get with that, and the less mistakes you make.
Right.
And Dan, you talked about it a little bit there, but I know this question comes up all the time too. How close, Dan? How close? And I know that's wildly dependent on the terrain. You kind of touched on that, but let's say it's postseason scouting. We're moving into that. A lot of guys are going to be heading out in the woods. I know a lot of times you get in the bed. Talk to me about one, tree selection. Like, are you thinking about the wind? Are you thinking about your access? Are you thinking about a lot of times in the winter, the leaves are off? How do you plan when the leaves are off for a leaf on scenario? Are you looking at the trees? So talk to me a bit about all that and how you're homing in on the tree for that setup.
Well, if I got in there spring scouting, be the detective, right? So I already know pretty much where I want to sit. I know where those beds are. I know how far that deer can see. I sat in that bed and I looked. So I got a real good grasp for that if I've been there in spring. Then it's not a problem. Then I know exactly where I got to be. It's the majority of the hunts, which are not you're hunting some exact bed, because like I'm going after a buck. I heard about one, I seen one. I'm in a different state. Now I'm kind of like, okay, I've looked at so many beds. I know what bed in their terrain is. You're following the sign. There's terrain up there that you're like, whatever's making the sign is bedding right there. But exactly where's that bed? Exactly how close can you get? That's where you got to kind of take an educated guess, but you're going to lean a little further back. You know what I mean? You're going to be a little more cautious. And for the most part, that costs me. Your average guy, I think that's one of the biggest mistakes, is that he pushes that envelope too far back. He doesn't push it close enough. He's not aggressive enough. He's too afraid he's going to blow it. This is my chance. I finally found a buck. The last thing I want to do is blow him into the next county. I am not going in there and just pushing him out of here. I'm going to sit back here, see what happens. Then I'm going to shift up here. Didn't see him yet. I'm going to move over here. And pretty soon he's like, I don't know what happened. That buck just disappeared. I never seen it. He was on the camera once or twice. Now I get him at midnight. I don't know what the heck is going on. You know what I do? I go straight to point A. And most of the time I blow it. Most of the time I send him in the next county, just like that guy thinks. But if 1 out of 5 times that buck walks out and I shoot it, hey, I do it in 5 times. You do it in 50 because of how you're staging your way in there. You're more likely to blow it than me.
Yeah, or never.
Because that buck's going to smell where you've been. It's like the equivalent of people think with their eyes. It's the equivalent of if you cut down all the trees in that buck's bed there and you stand out there in the field. Because he's going to know you were there. He's going to. So the only thing you can do is go for broke the very first time. Just go in there and take your best shot at it and try and kill him. And your first sit is always going to be your best. Most of the time, we all take a second or third sit at a spot. And that's when we shoot the 2 or 3 year olds. You get a nice buck and you're like, yeah, I've gotten bucks on my second sit. I've gotten bucks where I sit there all the time. How many 5 or 6 year olds have you got like that? When I look at my wall, the majority of deer I've gotten in spots I've sat before. But the very biggest ones, it's the very first time I hung a stand there. The very first time. The majority of them. And that's not the majority of the way we hunt. Because you only got so many spots. You only got so much time to scout.
Well, let's talk about old bucks versus young bucks. And you kind of talked about this earlier, but not in detail. And you kind of mentioned it with, those overlooked spots, those spots that nobody's going. But what about old bucks specifically? And you're talking about it now. It's your very first time. What attributes, thinking back to some of your biggest bucks, those 4, 5, 6-year-old bucks, what are some of the attributes of those bedding areas? Or if you look back at those as a whole that you think made those areas be able to hold that class of buck?
The one thing that's interesting about the very biggest bucks I've shot is that they do not have anywhere near as many bedding areas as the smaller bucks. They tend to hole up in small areas. They tend to be easier to figure out. They tend to be harder to kick out of a bedding area, harder to bump out of, harder to move. They're actually easier to hunt in that manner, that they're not really going to leave that easy. But with that said, they're usually in a spot that is so well set up that it's really hard to get in there, really hard to hunt that deer. And once he knows he's being hunted, it becomes almost impossible. They will move it dark. They'll move around you. They'll stay in cover. They'll go places where your scent's never been. And it gets really tough. But they tend to hole up in certain areas. Like I said, that buck I shot 2 years ago, that real big old buck, he was almost always bedding in the same area. Now, that area was like 5 acres. It was more spread out than that like acre we talk about, or less. But it was all in this little cattail area that had high spots and dry spots and bush here, bush there, no trees. You can't shoot from ground level because you're in cattails to your 10 feet high. You'd have to shoot, 6 inches in front of your arrow, or you ain't gonna deer 6 inches in front of your arrow. So it's just impossible to get close to him. So that's why he's there all the time. They'll pick these areas that are just impossible to kill him, but they're not as easy to bump. Now, in the same areas, you walk into a 2-year-old, 110-inch 8-pointer, and the thing will run for miles, and you never see the thing again. Even a 3-year-old will bump around quite a bit, but when they get older, they get a little more comfortable with human presence, with coyote presence and stuff. They can kind of stare you down. They'll more be like, okay, I know what he's doing. I know how he's going to go through here. They'll kind of think it through, kind of like you would. I mean, you think about it when you're a kid, and you're a freshman year of high school, and you took a wrong turn at school because you're not familiar with the high school yet, and you walk out into the smoking lounge, and I don't know if you had a smoking lounge, we did, and there's all the guys there in leather jackets that are like 10 times bigger than you, staring at you. What are you looking at, punk? And you're scared to death, right? But by the time you're a senior, even if you don't like those guys and you're still a small guy, you just walk right through that smoking lounge. You don't care about them, right? It's like, what are they going to do to me? You know what I mean? You still don't want to fight them. You still don't want to get into a match. You still don't make eye contact. You still don't cause problems, but you know how to deal with them, right? And that older buck does the same thing. He'll tolerate you. I've literally been in stand, and you have some pheasant hunter come through there, and you're cursing. What the heck is a pheasant hunter doing out here? I mean, you need swimming lessons or something? Why are you doing out here in waders pheasant hunting, right? You're looking at this guy like, really? Dude, I'm out here trying to hunt. He's got a right there like everybody else. And I'm not saying he shouldn't be there. So don't start writing the hate emails all over again. But yeah. But my point is it frustrates you. It frustrates every one of us when that happens, right? So he's coming through there, and you're thinking, it's over. I all this work, all this waiting for the right day, everything else, and here comes this guy, and you're confident that buck is in there, and he walks through there, and as he's going through, you watch that buck stand up in the bed and stare him down, watch him go past, and then lay down. Or you watch him hop out of the bed, go a distance, and then come walking back as the guy's leaving, and the dog's little bell is dinging, and watch him leaving, and then come back, sneaking back to the bed or back to the area. And you don't see that with those young bucks. You see them fly out of there. You see them run, bound. You hear them blowing in the distance. You know, bucks that are 5 or 6 years old are sly. They've been shot at. They probably got some lead in them. They got some broadheads in them. And they've learned some very, very hard lessons. Kind of like the freshman that got his butt kicked at school until, he got older and learned how to handle himself around people, right?
Yeah. Well, speaking of school, that goes along with another topic we were planning on discussing: studies, trail camera studies to be specific. So you have run cameras in beds, you've run cameras outside of bedding areas, on entrance exit trails, and a number of people on the Beast have also done similar experiments and posted
Yeah, and I've
their
had
findings.
a number of Beast members, when I was doing my camera studies, give me their cards that they ran a whole year in bedding areas. So I've looked at tons and tons of cameras that were run in bedding areas. And I did my own study with a dozen cameras in bedding areas. And I never did get that study done. There was just some really bizarre things that were going on with the camera batteries and stuff that kind of blew my stuff out. But I did get some good analysis from what I did learn. And some of the things that surprised me were it really nailed down my thought that there's like a 2-week period that's a peak period. I seen that a lot of these bedding areas. Those bucks can really wear out a bed in 2 weeks, where it looks like it's being used all the time. So don't let that fool you. The worn bed is good, but when's he using it? So now, what I noticed was, these beds got different timing. Some of them are like September. Some of them are like late September. Some of them are like early October, mid-October. Some of them are rut. Some of them have 2 different time periods. Some of them are more December-ish, right? So you got to, you really got to do the detective work. But I also noticed that you'll have a buck bed the same spot 2 days in a row. Then he ain't there the next day, and then he's there again. We did see a lot of, they came on certain winds. And one of the things that I believe is, you look at this bedding area as an acre, right? You got 15, 20 beds in there. Sometimes you got 50 beds in there, right? Your camera's covering 1. So maybe 2. So if that buck doesn't shift into that bed, he might be there and you don't get a picture of him. So that's one factor you got to take into it. But we did notice that the buck would be there for a period of about 2 weeks. He would be there like 50% of the time. Good buck. But you'd have like the same big buck bed there 2 days in a row, and the third day some other big buck beds there, and then the next day he's back. We also got a buck bedded in a spot on many occasions, and you get a picture of another buck walking in, that buck getting up and leaving, and the next buck coming in bedding down. Where the bigger buck, or the more, not necessarily always the bigger racked, but the more dominant buck will chase the subordinate buck out of the bed and get the bed he prefers. We found that interesting. But you might have the buck that you're hunting bed in that area 7 times in one season. What makes it sound like, oh my God, what are my odds of killing that thing? But those 7 times were all, within a 15, 16 day window, which puts your odds at like 40% that he's there, right? And then I think it'll even a little higher because there's a good chance he's in one of the other beds. Another one of the things was they lay in that bed for anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 or 3 hours, and usually no longer than that. Where what's interesting is I'll see a deer go into those bedding areas in the in the morning. I'll come in and hunt him in the evening, and he comes out of those bedding areas. But you watch him in that bed on the camera for 15 minutes. So they're moving around to different beds in that area for sure. But the good part about that is you probably get them on that camera. Now, the bad thing is, the one thing I seen quite a bit was we were getting tainted info because those deer can smell that camera and they can see that camera, and it's bothering them. Now, almost without question, every camera that was hung, no matter whether it was hung high, no matter what kind of flash it was, no matter what, the first couple of deer that came in would be like this, looking at it, even up in the trees. And then they wouldn't bed down. And maybe you see them again in 2 weeks and they come in staring at the camera as they're walking past it. And it takes them a long time to get used to it. They really, really are in tune with what's going on in their bedding area. And with that said, there's a better approach to it. And that better approach is to put the cameras on the exit trails from the bedding when they leave in the evening, because those are usually worn out, well-used bedding area or well-used trails that them bucks just come bolsing down in the evening when they come out. And then you get their picture and you know they were there. You don't have to see it in the bed to know it was there. Now, in the bed, you're seeing one bed and they're freaking out on that camera. They don't like it that much better in their staging area either, or further, close to the bedding area, but they tolerate it a hell of a lot better than in the bedding area. I would still probably get it elevated or someplace where they're not going to notice it. But even I got a ton of pictures of just giants staring at the camera. You get the first day you put the camera out there, that buck comes in and stares at it and he's gone. I had, when I first moved out here, there used to be a really good bedding area behind my house, but the DNR came in here and bulldozed it and dug a hole for ducks, and that's gone now. But when that was active, I would go back there and there'd just be these huge rubs right behind my house. And I'm like, there's something back here, living back here, There's a little bedding area in there. And I'm like, I kept thinking about it. And then August came and I hadn't been back there. And I thought, well, I'm just going to slide in there and put a camera in there. I put this camera in there and I got this picture. The very first day I put the camera in there, the evening, coming out of that bed in there, this massive 12-pointer, 12-point typical, clean. Came out of there, stared at that camera, and that was the only picture I ever got of it. First day I put the camera there. Now, he was bedding there. That was the end of it. He didn't feel secure there. So I seen that deer again. I seen him shining and glassing and stuff, but never anywhere near that bedding area again. You have to be careful around bedding areas. So the sole purpose of my camera research was not for killing deer, because I felt that it didn't help me kill deer. It hurt me. But what it did do is teach me some things about bedding. And to me, this bedding thing is really intriguing. And everything you learn about it makes you a better hunter. It makes you more knowledgeable about it. So that was all done in the purpose of learning about those bedding areas. If I was going to do it for hunting, those cameras are going back further. Most of the time, hunting cameras for me are not put anywhere near bedding. They're put in the feeding areas and stuff for more than one reason. The one reason is I don't want to spook the deer. Now, maybe if you put it in there long enough and you have big enough batteries, you maybe got a solar pack, it'll last and that'll work for you. And maybe that's the way some people got to do it. And I'm okay with that. But if I did that, my second thought would be that that's not really how I want to hunt. I would rather know the deer's there. Even that's a little bit cheating. But know the deer's at the food source. Know he's in the area. Now you know a deer is there. And now that you know he exists, now you use your skills, your scouting, the bedding areas that you know of to go hunt them down. Now, if you know that's a buck bedding area, why do you got to put a camera there? All you have to do is know there's a deer in the area, right?
Yeah.
But people need that pat on the back that like, no, you're right. You're right. He's there. Then you got to put the camera there. What you really need to know is that buck's in that woodlot, in that area. And then you go in for the kill. Deer tolerate a whole lot more at food sources. They tolerate a whole lot more on walking trails. Like when I hunted the Conservancy where Rick and Mario now hunt, I quit hunting there. There's a walking trail going through the whole thing. Now, what I noticed really quick was those deer were really touchy. You go back there, nobody goes back there much except for to walk that trail like nature lovers. Nobody really gets off that trail until hunting season. And when you get off that trail, those deer freak. But you'll be walking out there and you'll hear something, you stop and you watch, buck walk right across the trail, never even stop to smell the human tracks and go through. But he hits your scent out in the woods off of that trail, he'd freak. So you learn really quick, you could put your trail camera right alongside that trail and you're fine. You could hunt right alongside that trail and you're fine. And you could do it over and over again. So your camera can go where people frequent and deer will be okay with it. You don't have to get a daylight picture. You just have to get a picture of that buck to know he's there. You have to know that there's a target there. So if I got a picture of a buck at 8:30 on a day when it gets dark at 7, I know he's living right there somewhere. He's not traveling that far in an hour and a half of darkness. They don't move very fast. They feed their way. So I know he's right there somewheres. Okay, now where are those bedding areas? Where could he have come from? What direction was he traveling on that camera? What wind was it? Which bedding areas are windward? Which bedding areas were for that time frame when I did my detective work? And you start narrowing it down to, okay, there's 5 spots I think he could be in, and you hunt those 5 spots down the next 5 days.
Yeah, and I hope everyone's been paying attention because, Dan, you gave a ton of examples of like nuances that you're looking at. I mean, thinking back to some of the stuff you said, like, oh, I looked at the bed and there was curled leaves in it, right? The leaves weren't flattened out. And I think those are the kind of details that separate your scouting from what a lot of people are doing, myself included, especially early on, is like looking at that stuff and reasoning. You're looking at, well, why are these leaves curved? Because nothing's laid in there yet, right? And these leaves didn't fall until November. So it's kind of that,
it's funny because some of that stuff is, once you learn it, it's so obvious. But it takes you a long time to start looking for that stuff. I think your average guy says, I'm going to check this Infalt guy out because he's killing a lot of bucks and, he's got this info. And they listen to it and they're like, I don't know about this. You don't go in bedding areas, you kick all the deer off your property. It just sounds goofy. I can't hurt on January. I'm going to just go look at some of these bedding areas, see what he's talking about. There's no way they don't even bed in the same spots. And the guy walks out and he walks into one of them glowing bedding areas where there's just, 20 beds and they're worn into the dirt and there's huge rubs there. He's like, I'm going to kill one. And he leaves. He doesn't even know what tree to hunt out of when he leaves. And I bet you the majority of people that are that are listening right now that have followed the beast for a while will tell you the same thing. The first time they went out and found a bedding area, they really weren't even prepared correctly to hunt it. They just got excited. You know what I mean? But yeah. the other thing is that they just camp out there and overhunt it, because they think that that's where the deer are going to be all the time. And like I said, even though it glows like that, it's pretty much usually a 2-week or 3-week period of peak use. And you got to really pinpoint that peak use. I wish I could have $1 for every time somebody told me that when they find a good area like that, a good bedding area, they save it for rut. It just blows my mind because some of those areas aren't even used in rut. Some of them aren't at all used in rut, and so it's crazy. You think about you look at my bucks, hunting bedding areas. The majority of my biggest bucks, the biggest bucks I've shot, the overall majority of them are like opening week of the season, not rut. Now, that's not the majority of bucks that I've shot and mounted, but I'm talking when you start talking 5 years old and older, the majority of them are from like the first week or so of the season. Matter of fact, opening day has been phenomenal for me.
Yeah. Well, Dan, again, we had a whole bunch of topics. We're not going to get through them all. So I think next week, maybe we'll pick up the ones we didn't. We're going to do some Q&A here, and we don't want to go 3 hours. So let's get into some questions, and let's start out with Colton Risley says, how do you approach bucks bedding in a large greenbrier thicket? He says it's 5 to 20 acres. It's too loud to get into the thicket, and the mature bucks won't leave before dark. What are you doing in a situation like that?
Well, if you know they're bedding kind of in the middle of it and you know they're not coming out in daylight, the best thing you can do is have pre-scouted it, know how they're coming in there, find the best setup you can that's as close as possible, and be there on the right day. That's the best you can do. I mean, there's a lot of situations that I hunt where I cannot kill the buck because of how far he's got to move. But if you hit it on the right day, all deer move distances sometimes. If they didn't make mistakes, we'd never kill them. None of us would, because some of their setups are too perfect. And I mean, if you just simply can't get that close, I mean, if you can't, pre-clip a way in to get closer, or there's nothing you can do, I would probably, if I knew the bedding areas in that whole mountain well, I probably would hunt that anyways and give it a shot, even though it's low odds. Or I'd walk in there and just kick the deer out of there so you can't bed there. That's just a free ride. There's a lot of people that I know that have those impossible bedding areas, and they just sit and wait and never kill anything. And they're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Well, why are you letting them bed there? Why, you'll never kill them. You'll die of old age. So you got to either try to figure something out to get close. You got to either get the timing right for when he does come out, or just don't let him bed there. Make him bed someplace where you can kill him.
Yeah, that was my first thought too. Unless it's a small property and that's your only option, tough nut to crack there. But it's a bigger property with multiple bedding areas. Get them out of there. Tim Crane says, will deer bed near major highways, giving up sound and potentially smell advantage for the sake of avoiding pressure? So have you ever seen any big ones by the highway?
Absolutely, all the time. There's a spot when I drive home from work. It's in Delafield. If any of you live around me, you know where I'm talking about. There's a Walmart there, and we're at the intersection of Highway 83 and 94. There's a big hillside that's wooded. I love it when it snows to watch that hillside because it just fills up with deer right alongside of Walmart there. I slow down and watch the deer. They get hit there crossing the highway all the time too, but you see them in their beds. I even parked at Walmart one time, and I believe that's city ground anyways. I just took a walk in there because I want to see if there's any sheds laying in those beds, and there's some worn out beds in there like crazy, all on it, right alongside the expressway. And I see that all the time. And as a matter of fact, some of my best bedding areas are alongside expressways and highways and stuff, because those are the spots where people don't hunt. They don't sit right alongside the highway. Deer will sit there and they can differentiate the smell of the highway from you. They'll know if there's the person, they'll know where you're coming from. They can smell those wind currents, and they'll use the currents to their advantage. And the smell won't be an issue at all for a deer from the highway smell or whatever. But the noise is a little bit of an issue. So they'll probably use wind and sight to bed there.
Yeah, Dan, I don't know if you ever watch Lee, that guy from Seek One that does all the urban hunting. If that doesn't prove to you that deer will bed in some pretty urban, unusual places, I don't know what will, because he shoots some big bucks in some very what would be considered, I don't know if it's high pressure, but just very urban environments. Dan, George Hamrick says, how far are you seeing buck bedding areas changed based on the wind? Do you see bucks that have bedding areas far from their predominant wind bed, or are they just shifting in the main bedding area?
So I think what he's saying is how far will a buck wind shift?
That's what it sounds like. Yep.
Yeah, usually they're pretty short. I haven't seen major shifts. Like I haven't seen them walk across big open fields and things like that, but I've watched them walk across whole valleys to a point on the other side. But most of the wind shifts aren't that big. I mean, a lot of times these bucks will pick a spot because it has, especially mature bucks, and especially like in hill country, they'll pick a spot because they can move around under different winds, especially if it's like a westerly wind. They might get caught off guard when it's an east, and a lot of times they still won't give up their bedding spot. I mean, the biggest buck I ever shot, I killed on a wind shift when he wouldn't get up and move, because where he was bedded was a singular bed, which is a rarity. You rarely find a single worn bed. You do find some, but that's the abnormal thing. But this buck bedded in a single worn bed because it was a really good position under a willow tree. And that buck always bedded there on a west wind. I should say always, but most of the time on a west wind, he was there for a 2-year period. And it drove me nuts and you all know the story of me crawling in and killing it. But I crawled in and killed him on the day that the wind in the middle of the day or late morning shifted from west all the way to east. And I felt in my heart, that buck is not getting up and walking through that open grass a long distance. He's going to stay there. And then I snuck in and killed him. So they're not going to make themselves super vulnerable for it. It's going to make them super paranoid. But usually the wind shifts aren't very far. Wind shifts, a lot of them are 20, 30 yards because they get a point. One of their favorite spots in the hill country that I find is these long, narrow points that kind of twist around, because there's all different kinds of spots along there where they can get the wind to their advantage. By just moving a little ways around one of the bends or something, they can have the wind, they smell it from the right direction somehow or another. That, or they use the thermal hubs where they get that swirling wind, or down in the a draw where the wind always toilet bowls. So those mature bucks pick those premium spots, and it's usually the younger bucks that are way more out on just a bench on the open leeward ridge or something. So when they do get caught off guard, I think they will move if it's a reasonable distance. I mean, they might move 100, 200 yards and you get a crack at them. But they're not going to move a huge distance, and they're going to try and use cover to do it.
Dan, Matthew Cross says, are you planning on doing scouting workshops this year? And if so, do you know the dates yet?
I am, and I have not released the dates yet. I believe one of them is either the last weekend in January or the first weekend of February, but I got to figure out another one yet. I don't have them down quite yet. We've been going over different things that we got to get done and what days we got to do it, but I'm trying to get that done really fast. I told everybody at Christmas I'd have them done, and I don't yet, but I will soon. And I am also trying to work out a hill country workshop this year.
And Dan, once you get those dates nailed down, I'm sure we'll talk about them here, but you're going to advertise those anywhere else on the forum or your Facebook page?
Absolutely. I keep all I get a ton of emails about it, and I always send to email people the first chance, because some of them fill up really fast. And then after the email people, then I'll go on the forum and then Facebook. So if you really want to make sure you don't miss, email me.
And what's the best email for that, Dan?
The Hunting Beast, the in the front, the Hunting Beast at AOL.com.
So there you go. There's a perk to listening to the show. If you email Dan directly, you'll have first crack at getting in the workshop. So
I don't always answer all those emails, but I will send an email. I keep them.
Dan, Joel Christoph says, Happy New Year, guys. Dan, how long do you think you spend on stand per hunt? So how early are you getting out there?
So I probably usually spend about 3 hours on stand at a time. Sometimes more, sometimes less, depending. I mean, if I get out of work and I got done, something was going on and I got like an hour and a half till dark, I'll race out and hunt a spot. I mean, especially if it's a spot it wouldn't have got hunted anyways. I mean, I might as well. You ain't gonna kill one sitting on your couch. And there's a lot of times I've killed really good bucks on a last minute rush hunt. So I'll do that. But I think as long as I'm in there within a couple hours before sunset, I'm fine. But that said, there's certain spots where I think deer might hear me, or there could be an issue where I try to get in earlier. and try to get like midday or something and let it calm down. Because like if they hear a branch break or something, they'll remember it for a while, but they ain't gonna remember it for 4 hours.
Yeah. Another advantage to getting in early that I've found is a lot of times in the evening, and especially in the Midwest, when the winds start to die down, it's a lot noisier. You get in 3 o'clock or whatever, a lot of times that wind's still whipping pretty good, and that'll cover a lot of your access.
That's real true. I was thinking about that while I was saying that too. That is absolutely true. But there's another issue, and it's the opposite of what you're saying. The longer you're there, the more likely you get one of those little back swirls.
Right.
And it's all over.
Yeah.
And I've had that happen on those, like you try to push an all day hunt or something, sooner or later you get a switch. You try to sit there from noon on, and then at 2 p.m. you get a switch, and you didn't have to be there till 3 or 4. Because there's reasons they bed in those spots, and it usually is kind of wind dependent. There's little swirls and stuff. Usually the swirls are by the bedding, not exactly where you're hunting, but it just takes a heavy one to suck your scent back in there too. You know what I mean? Like a vacuum effect. If it's if it's swirling on the tree edge, it kind of pulls your scent, or if there's a thermal, if it gets strong enough. So I try not to give them too much opportunity to detect me. It can go both ways. You can be there too early. You can be there too late. Like you said, I don't want to go out there when it's dead calm.
Yeah.
I don't like that. That's why I think I got busted in the UP. It's because we did go in a little late on that hunt because we scouted so much. And it was dead silent when we went in there. And it was windier earlier in the day. Not much windier, but maybe enough. And then I believe that snapped branch is what got me busted. So I snapped a branch, and I think he heard it.
It's tough. It's tough to find the right balance. That's why it's hunting, right?
Yep.
Dan, Big Woods OG, are you logging dates and times of the year bucks are used in certain bedding areas, and then knowing which time of year they'll be in that bedding area? So how are you keeping track of, you talked about maybe that 2-week golden period. How do you keep track of so many spots?
If I were you, I'd keep it in a notebook. I generally keep it up here. But when I was younger, I kept a notebook, and it worked out really good. And I can say one thing about the notebook is I firmly believe everything I have up here is absolutely 100% correct. But when I did keep a notebook and I went back and looked at my notebook would always lie to me.
Yeah.
And I would see that my notes differed a little from what I believed. So notebooks help a lot. Like if you keep a journal, I don't. I just been too busy. I should, but I don't. Another thing is I'm really into the bedding. I'm really into it. So when I go out and look at it, I'm really thinking about it. So it kind of locks in. I might not remember what's going on at work or even where I live or how to find my way to the grocery store, but I can remember everything about a bedding area. You only use so much of your brain,
That's right. You got to dedicate it to the important stuff.
Right.
Paul Pereira. Sorry if I said that wrong, Paul. Bedding question. How do bucks change their bedding when the seasons change? Does winter bedding equate to late summer, fall bedding? So I think what he's asking is if you find late summer, fall bedding, are the deer going to be there in winter also? Why or why not?
Generally not. The bedding differs quite a bit. You can find them in the same spots, but not necessarily. Usually your winter bedding, like your bedding like right about now, is you just start looking for the the highest stem counts. It's where you're going to find them. Where the highest stem counts are and where there's food. Those two things collide, and you will have every deer in the woods there. You won't have every deer in the woods there any other time of the year, but you'll have deer there somewhat. Usually the spots that they bed now, there's deer that hang there a little bit all year, but there's different reasons they bed every portion of the year. They're pretty free about their bedding, in summer, right into season in Wisconsin, because we start in early September. those places that start early, I mean, you really get a benefit on the big bucks from that early start. I really wish we started September 1st. But there are places that do, and you get a little of that summer betting and the way they move around. But they'll bed more in the open, more up higher, out of the swamps, bed real close to food sources, walking in daylight. Then as fall comes, they start shifting into the heavier bedding a little more, and they start using the points and the wind a little more. It almost seems like, I don't know how to say this, but it almost seems like something changes in a deer when his antlers harden. They start getting smart. It's like, and then they get stupid again when when their antlers go off. Because during the summer, I mean, you can drive up to them, look at them out your window and stuff, and watch them in fields. But as soon as they get that hard antlers, it's almost like they know that that's hunting time. Even the younger deer, there's something that gives them a paranoia or something. But there's just different places they go, almost every couple of weeks. And you really got to be on top of all the bedding in your area to see kind of how they shift through there and where they go and that kind of thing. Hopefully you find some primary bedding where they bed there a lot more than the 2 weeks. But for the most part, most of these bedding areas, you're going to find a 2 or 3 week peak period that they bed there. And that's going to shift all the time during the year.
Yeah. And just to follow up what you said there, Dan, I couldn't agree more. Coming from Michigan, which always has an October 1st opener, to Montana, which always has a first Saturday in September. So sometimes it's the 1st and as late as the 7th. What a night and day difference. I mean, Montana is lower pressure for deer in general too, but I always heard that stuff, but I didn't really have anything to base it on other than what I heard. But seeing it firsthand, that early September pattern is a great time to shoot a good buck. Let's do 2 more here, Dan. Crazy. I don't know if I've ever seen a question like this. Will turkeys push deer, mature bucks out of their bedding areas and cause them to relocate if a flock comes through into the bedding area to roost? Have you ever had that experience?
I never have. I've had turkeys and deer right next to each other a lot, and I've never seen that. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but I've never seen it. I've seen deer and turkeys come in together. I've seen deer around me when turkeys roost, and they stare at the turkeys, and I'm sure they see it all the time.
And let's do yeah, I don't have any experience there. I mean, I've seen turkeys and deer together, so I would think it doesn't bother them, but I can't think of a time specifically where they've roosted right next to a deer and whether that would bother them or not. But I don't have that experience firsthand. Let's see, catfish noose. I think that's how it says, or knee use. Not sure. Can you give me an example of when you wait for a better shot or take the first shot you have? If you have a good shot, do you take the first good shot you have? So when are you waiting? When are you shooting right away?
For me, my shooting hasn't been always working out the greatest. So I don't know if you want to ask me that, but when a target buck comes in, generally, if it's a mature buck, if it's a 5 or 6 year old buck that I've been really targeting, not just one that I'm like, okay, I'll shoot that one. But if it's one I'm targeting, I want that arrow in it as fast as possible. But I do not want to wound it. I don't want to just throw out arrows out there like a madman, right? So it's the first ethical shot that I'm sure I can make is what I take. And there's a reason for that. You don't want them to be wandering around too much because generally they pick you off. They're bedding in areas where there's wind currents, there's thermals, there's all kinds of crazy stuff, and that's why they're bedding there. They're bedding there because they can bust you. And then on top of that, the types of areas where I find these big bucks generally don't have the types of trees you hunt out of. You're hunting out of scrubby bushes. Sometimes I'm 4 feet off the ground. Sometimes I'm 10. Sometimes I'm in a tree that has no limbs, is dead, and there ain't no another tree around. And I'm trying to look like a straight, 6-inch tree, pried up against a tree, trying not to be seen above cattails. So the types of trees that we hunt out of in those bedding areas are not optimal. I mean, you're likely to get busted. The wind currents, you're likely to get busted, even when you got a great setup. And you got to take the shot when you have it. they bust pretty easy. I mean, I would always say that it seems to me that like there's an area like I would say within about 10 yards of your tree, maybe a little closer, that when they get into that area, they're almost impossible to kill. You want them out, 15, 20 yards to kill them. I mean, you don't want them getting too close because they're onto everything that goes on around them when they're that close.
Yeah, you're on my mind there, Dan, because I was thinking of a time or two. I mean, deer, they have good hearing, but not amazing hearing, but they get that close, and even if they're not smelling you, if you got any kind of noise in your clothing or your arrow rest or anything when they're that close, it's like they hear you or they smell you, or it's like there's just so many things that can go
eyes on
wrong.
the sides of their heads too, and just the slightest movement of pulling the bow back, they'll catch it, even kind of behind them. You know what I mean? They're just on edge to anything that close. We're like they're used to as they're walking into an area. Squirrel runs up a tree in a distance or whatever, things like that, and they'll just take a look over there, and if it stops moving, they're okay. Happens close, they really check it out. They just lock on it. And it's not with all deer. There's something about those mature bucks where they didn't get that big by being stupid or not learning those hard lessons, and you just can't let them get too close. You want to get an arrow in them pretty quick.
Yeah.
If you're there to kill them and not just make cool videos or something, you just want to get an arrow in them fast. And I don't know if you've noticed, but my videos are usually not too pristine because that's what I'm doing, is trying to get an arrow in that deer fast.
It's all filming stuff. We'll have to talk about that in another episode, but I've learned that over the last couple of years. It's real tough. So, well, Dan, I think that'll probably wrap it up for today. We're going to have some more betting talk, and if we run out of betting talk in the next episode, which I don't think we will, but if we do, we're going to start getting into some preseason scouting stuff, I think, going into the spring too. So that's all I had for today. So Dan, any closing words?
Get out there and scout. It's that time of year.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. If we didn't get to your question, pop in next week. We'll try to get to all the questions we can, but we are limited on time. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you then.
Thanks everybody.
Bye.